GDP. What is it and what does it say about Canada? Everyone talks about GDP, politicians brag about it, news anchors report on it, and economists can never agree where it's headed. GDP isn't just a number in Ottawa, it shapes your paycheck, your rent, and even the price of your morning coffee. But what is GDP really? Does national GDP or GDP per capita matter more for you? And more importantly, what does Canada's $3.1 trillion economy actually say about how we live, work, and spend? Because while GDP growth sounds like something that happens on a spreadsheet, it's actually a story about you. GDP, or gross domestic product, by definition is a monetary measure of the total market value of all the final goods and services produced. But what does this actually mean? At its core, GDP is the total value of everything a country produces in a given year. Think of it like Canada's national income statement, a single number showing how busy our economy is. There are three ways to measure it. The first is the production approach, what's made. This method takes the total value of something produced and subtracts the value of the goods used to produce it. For example, if a manufacturer's total output is worth $4 billion, but it spends $3 billion on the material to make it, this is adding $1 billion to GDP. The total GDP of the country is calculated by the value added by all industries. The second is the income approach, what people earn. This is done by adding up the income earned by all households and the profits earned by companies. And the third and final approach is the expenditure approach, what's spent. To calculate it this way, you add the private spending of all households, the investment of all business, government spending, and the exports minus the imports. Luckily, we don't have to do the math ourselves. Stats Canada handles that, updating GDP figures every quarter. Theoretically, all three approaches should yield the same result since they are a measure of the same economy. However, in initial releases like in monthly or quarterly GDP stats, Canada uses the most timely but less complete data available. These estimates are not perfectly aligned and are accompanied with a statistical discrepancy. A final, more complete measure of GDP for a given year is released 34 months later after all the relevant data has been collected and measured. So what does Canada's GDP look like today? As of 2024, our economy produced roughly $3.1 trillion worth of goods and services. That makes us the 9th largest economy in the world, just behind Italy and ahead of Russia. If you divide that by population, you get 59,000 per person. That's GDP per capita, a rough measure of economic output per Canadian. Now, where does that money come from? Services account for 70 to 75% of our economy. That's banking, healthcare, retail, tech, and education. Manufacturing, about 10%, which includes auto, aerospace, and food processing, and resources make up the rest. This is mining, forestry, agriculture, oil, and gas. Geographically, most of Canada's GDP comes from Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia, with roughly 85% combined. So while we often imagine Canada as a land of natural resources, most of our wealth actually comes from people providing services. Why does GDP matter? Governments love when GDP grows, because it usually means more jobs, more income, and most importantly for them, more tax revenue. If GDP shrinks, that's recession. This is technically defined as 2 quarters in a row of economic decline. Policymakers will use GDP to try to steer the economy and make informed decisions regarding fiscal and monetary policies. Governments may see GDP growing too slowly or even negatively and increase spending or reduce taxes in an effort to stimulate the economy. The central bank, the Bank of Canada, uses GDP as a tool to aid in determining if interest rates should be moved. If GDP is rising too quickly, this could indicate the economy is getting too hot and lead to inflation, so they may increase interest rates to try to slow the economy. Or inversely, if the economy is in contraction or decline, they may lower interest rates to help boost it. Even individuals and businesses will track GDP as an important data marker for investment decisions. For example, if GDP is increasing quickly, this may signal a need to invest in more workers, machinery, and materials in order to grow revenues with the expanding economy. So why does GDP matter to you? As we've seen, yes, GDP is an important metric for many reasons. However, how do we relate this to you on an individual level? This can be done by measuring GDP per capita, which is easily done by taking the total GDP and dividing it by the population. This is widely used to evaluate and compare the the economic output, prosperity, and standard of living of everyone. A higher GDP per capita is associated with more and better infrastructure, healthcare, and education. But here's the problem. Canada's GDP per capita has barely moved in a decade. In 2015, it was about $57,500, and in 2024, it was just shy of $59,000. That is a compounded annual growth rate of just 0.35%. Compare this to our southern neighbor, USA, which had a very similar GDP per capita as Canada with $57,000 in 2015, where theirs is now at $89,000, which has been a growth rate of 1.8%. So why has Canada fallen behind? Much of Canada's growth has been fueled by adding people in immigration, not by increasing productivity per person. Canada's government is trying to tackle this issue with multiple changes. They've made a multi-billion-dollar investment in AI and tech research to help boost productivity, and another $3.5 billion was allocated to research infrastructure and research grants to support scientific endeavors and foster homegrown talent. And measures are being introduced to help eliminate red tape for major projects. They have also recently tightened their immigration policy by trying to reduce the number of temporary residents and capping international students. Analysts disagree on how this will affect Canada's GDP per capita, however many suggest it will be positively impacted. These changes will make a shift towards skilled workers and may cause the economy to focus and make investments on productivity increases instead of being fueled by an excess of cheap labor. So what does Canada's GDP actually reveal about Canada? First, it shows what fuels our economy. We're not a factory nation or a farming giant, we're a service-based, trade-reliant economy. Second, it highlights regional imbalances. Alberta's oil and gas pull far above average, while Atlantic Canada and parts of the north contribute far less to total GDP. Third, it shows a deep economic link to the United States, with roughly 30% of Canada's GDP coming from exports, and nearly 3/4 of that goes south to the US. Finally, it shows our weakness in our productivity growth. Almost all of our GDP growth has come from a growing population, not from Canadians producing more per worker. So if population growth slows, GDP growth could slow too, unless we become more productive. So looking ahead, over the next decade, economists expect Canada's GDP growth to remain moderate, around 1.5 to 2% a year. But there are real challenges ahead, like an aging population leaving the workforce, a high household debt limiting future spending, and trade uncertainty with our largest partner, the United States, with the ongoing tariff disputes. However, on the positive side, there have been investments in energy, AI, and advanced manufacturing with the hope to push our economy higher. These investments all have the goal of not just GDP growth, but also our GDP per capita. So next time you hear that Canada's GDP grew 2%, remember it's not just a number from Stats Canada, it's a sum of millions of small actions, every hour worked, every dollar spent, and every service provided. GDP tells us how much we produce, and GDP per capita tells us how much that production is worth to you. If you found this video helpful, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment on what you would like me to discuss in the future.